This panel is the result of the hard work of many folks here at the Evergreen State College Tacoma campus, most especially including Dr. Gilda Shepard, who has helped bring in some really important guests who are here with us today. So thank you to you, Dr. Shepard. Human beings have moved around as part of our existence from time immemorial due to quest for food, stable living conditions, marriage, forced migration, slavery, war, famine, drought, disease, and many other reasons. My own family immigrated to the US from Mexico on my father's side and from Ireland on my mother's side. Movement and migration was even built into the work that my family did. My great-grandfather and my grandfather worked on the railroads north out of Mexico, and my grandmother's father was a laborer building roads in Mexico. The whole family ended up working to make steel in the mills of Northwest Indiana, steel that was used for rails and cars and bridges and ships. Though moving has been part of our histories, there are differences in our migration stories due to different levels of access and different dangers in both the places we've left and the places we've come to. Today's panel focuses on Black, Latinx, and Native perspectives on migration. We have with us today Kendra Aguilar, Kiara Daniels, Christopher Paul Jordan, and Maria Isabel Morales. I'll introduce each panelist, and then I want to ask them an initial question. I'll ask one other question, and then I'll take questions from you all. You can send questions as the speakers speak to me directly in the chat, and I will share them after the first two rounds of questions with our panelists. So let me introduce our panelists. Kendra Aguilar is a descendant of Liceño and indigenous Mexican people. She is a graduate of Evergreen's MPA Tribal Governance Program, as well as the Native Pathways Program, NPP, where she currently teaches. Her work focuses on tribal food sovereignty and food justice, digital equity, and she is currently researching her own family's migration stories as part of her dissertation work around indigenous educational trauma. Thank you for being with us, Kendra. Soon to be Dr. Aguilar. Kiara Daniels is a proud Tacoma native, resident of Central Tacoma and longtime community advocate. Growing up in Tacoma's Hilltop neighborhood, Kiara learned the importance of giving back and contributing to a strong community. Kiara graduated from Tacoma Public School of the Arts and then went on to the Evergreen State College Tacoma campus, and then on to earn her master's degree in public administration from the Evergreen State College Olympia campus. Kiara currently works as the business and community development coordinator for SpaceWorks Tacoma, a program of the Tacoma Pierce County Chamber of Commerce. There, Kiara leads the Hilltop Business Support, aiming to secure space and resources for Black businesses in the Hilltop Business District. In addition to her work with the Chamber, Kiara demonstrates her passion for housing, economic justice, and community-centered design through her leadership as a core member of Fab 5, helping to lead the hashtag Design the Hill initiative. Last year, Kiara was awarded City of Tacoma's Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Emerging Leader Award for her commitment to service and describes all of her work as her love letter to the city. Thank you for being with us, Kiara. We have also with us Christopher Paul Jordan, who is an artist living and working in Tacoma, Washington, USA. He makes paintings, sculptures, and installations as time capsules for displaced folks to hold, bury, connect, and reintegrate our stories. Christopher Paul Jordan says this about his work, quote, "I'm interested in the afterlife of memories and shared experience, and in particular, how oral tradition functions, persists, rests, evolves, and endures in conditions of diaspora. My studio practice deals with continuance, analog internets, infrastructures of knowledge and care, and technologies for corresponding with locations beyond reach. Welcome, Christopher Paul Jordan. And finally on the panel, we have Dr. Maria Isabel Morales, the daughter, granddaughter, and great-granddaughter of Mexican migrant workers and a first-generation bilingual immigrant herself. Maria Isabel Morales is currently a member of the faculty at the Evergreen State College. Morales teaches in cultural studies, in education, Latinx studies, and political economy. She draws from intersectional analysis and critical pedagogy in her teaching inside and outside the classroom. Collaborations with indigenous and immigrant children and youth in Washington State and in Oaxaca, Mexico have taught her critical lessons about sustainability, community, and love. Dr. Morales is also the faculty of the Gateways for Incarcerated Youth this year. Welcome, Dr. Morales. I now want to start with a general question about, to you panelists, a little bit about your background and your connection to migration. Would each of you tell us, where did you grow up and how did your family get there? What were some of the social, economic, political, and personal forces that led to this movement? And I'll put the question in the chat as well. Dr. Morales, go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Zaragoza, and thank you all for the invitation. And it's an honor to be here joining y'all. I'm always so excited to be invited to Tacoma events, Evergreen events. I live in Tacoma, so I also feel like I'm close in sort of this different way. I'm happy to really be here with y'all. I really appreciate that question. It's a great question to start. Where do we grow up and how do we get there, right? I was born in Michoacan, Mexico, and Michoacan is one of the largest states in Mexico. It's also one of the largest sending states of migrants to the United States. It has been for a long time and continues to be. I lived in Michoacan for the first 5.5 years of my life. And in Michoacan is where all my maternal grandparents are from. At the age of 5.5, I and my brother, who was 4, crossed the US-Mexico border. So we came as kids. And so I have memories of being in Michoacan, even though I was so young, but most of the memories that I still have are revolving around the days of our migration, when our immigration began. So I think it's really, it continues to be really telling to me that what I remember in Mexico is all around the days before, during, and after kind of my immigration journey began. At the age of 5.5, it was really my mom's decision. My father had been coming to the United States, to California. He would come to the US for some months, he would work, he would go back to Mexico as an undocumented worker. At the time, he says it was much easier to cross, right? And he came and worked and he went back to Mexico. My maternal and paternal grandfathers were also doing the same. My mom's dad kind of crossed and was a guest worker in sort of the last part of the Bracero program, which was a guest worker program during World War II that emerged out of sort of a need for labor. And so he kind of came in the last part of that. But my great-grandfather also, and I recently found out this story, and I was also really fascinated by his story because I heard Anthony's stories and there's this sort of connection I didn't know. But we found this picture of my great-grandfather somewhere in Indiana. And it turns out part of the stories is that he was a laborer in steel in the 1930s and 40s. And we recently found that story. So I lived 5 years in Michoacan. We crossed the border as kids. I remember crossing over. I remember the fear I had. I remember hearing about La Migra and how I needed to make sure that I told everybody and told La Migra that my uncle who was crossing us was my father. And we crossed over at the same time as my mother was crossing through the desert with my father. I lived in California, in the East Bay area in California. until I was 16 years old. And I've been in Washington State since the age of 17. I lived in Eastern Washington, and now I'm here in Tacoma. So I've lived in many places in my life. And my story is also reflective of my family's stories. We moved around a lot. I have family distributed all across California. I have family in Washington. I have family in Arizona. I still have family in Michoacan. And a lot of our memories are in these same territories and places, but a lot of the memories and the stories that have been passed down from my grandfather, my grandmother to us are of stories in other parts of the United States. And they're almost always connected to labor and labor needs. And so how did I get here? With the same ways my parents and my great-grandparents' movements, it seems to be an intricate part of our identities and our stories as a family and as a people. Now I'm here. I don't know what my generation and young other generations will look like, but these are still stories and memories, migration and movement. And it's always, almost always around labor, at least in the first parts of our journeys. And then starting with my grandfather, there was kind of a need, and we all came to the US to reunify, to reconnect with families. And also there's a very important part of my family. We left Michoacan because of the economic struggles we had in Michoacan. We did own land. We had ejidos, communal owned land in Mexico that are still in our family, but it was really difficult to survive. And to this day, the family I have in Michoacan continue to experience really tremendous violence as a result of the drug cartel violence that is in Mexico. So it's all part of my family, all part of my stories. I am here in Washington, this is home, but I am from many other places as well.
Thank you so much, Dr. Morales. I'm going to go to Kiara Daniels next. Welcome, Kiara. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me. It is really a pleasure. First of all, I always love to come back and speak because I feel like it was just yesterday that I was in Lyceum, probably in trouble for being late or not paying attention or not doing my reading, just kidding. But I'm looking at the topics and the books you all are reading, and I wish that I was reading this at the time because, just thinking about my family story and how we got to Tacoma, just triggers so many questions and so much history that I don't feel like we have anywhere. It feels like I just have to ask. And, my grandmother died at a young age before I even got to meet her. So, I'm just kind of putting the pieces together with my parents. But a little bit about me. I was born here in Tacoma, at Tacoma General on the Hilltop in 1989. But both of my parents and really my whole family is from East Oakland. And so I asked my mom, why did we move here? Why did we, to me, East Oakland or Oakland in general seems like an amazing place to be. It's sunny, so much to do. And there was so many movements going on that I could have been a part of if we were there. But they moved here in 1974, and there was a lot of things going on in the 70s in Oakland, and my uncles were thinking about getting into activism. I always wondered why we had pictures of the Panthers and so many things around, right? Like all these things I didn't get to experience, but I just hear about. So my grandmother moves her kids down here because it's getting rough to raise 7 kids in Oakland. And so she moves to Hilltop, Tacoma, and that is where my family has been. My dad moved here also from East Oakland, but separately. And later on, I think in the 80s, to come work at Boeing. So he left, I think he was in the Army for a little bit and then came to work at Boeing, and that really changed his life and really solidified his space here. And so I wonder how much of our story has to do with working and has to do with finding resources and jobs to survive. Interestingly enough, both of my parents' family, my father's family is from Arkansas originally. And I think my mom's family, she'll probably correct me if I tell it wrong, but I think they're from Louisiana. And, as people move and as we don't know to ask these questions, some of our history gets lost and our families are kind of torn apart. So we know that things happen to us, but we don't know why. And it has been so fun to ask those questions and to have them ask each other and relive their history. So I'll leave it at that. I think that was most of the question, right? Anything else I forgot?
Yes, thank you. And you'll have a chance to get to answer some more and make more connections as we interweave the stories of the panelists. Thank you so much for being with us. And it's good to see you again. I'm glad you're back. Welcome
Likewise.
home.
Thank you.
I'm going to now go to Kendra Aguilar. Same initial question. Where did you grow up and how did your family get there? What were the social, economic, political, and personal forces that led to that movement and the movements that you've had during your life? We need you to unmute.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Miyuyam. Good morning, everybody. And for me too, it's an honor to be here with these amazing panelists. I'm so excited to learn more about you, your work, and your stories. So thank you for having me and for inviting me. I was also born here in Tacoma on the ceded lands of the Puyallup Nation and grew up for the first few years of my life. I was raised on Bainbridge Island, which is the ceded lands of the Suquamish Nation. My maternal side of my family was from Arkansas also. So Kiara, we have some things in common. And they were of mostly Scottish and Welsh descent, and they lived in the Ozarks. So they were hill people, mountain people, and had a pretty rough life, poverty, murder. You hear of the Hatfields and the McCoys, and that was sort of the life that my family was living on that side. And on my father's side, his mother's family were from Germany, and they fled Germany in the late 1700s due to political unrest and differences. They had democratic political leanings, and that didn't sit well with the current government. So they kind of fled for the New World and settled in Texas. And my grandfather on my father's side is descended from indigenous Mexican peoples, and due to the complex histories of colonization of those lands, we don't have a lot of details as far as the peoples he descended from. But for the other part of my family, who are Luiseño, they were the first peoples of the lands of California. And so our stories of motion and the sort of the tapestry that makes up our family is both through immigration and of course displacement of the original inhabitants of these lands. And my native grandfather was orphaned and sent to live at the Sherman Institute, which is an Indian boarding school in Corona, California. And when he grew up and graduated, there were no jobs for Native folks in California. In fact, all the signs in the windows would say, Indians need not apply. So he went off to college on the East Coast, and eventually, World War II was taking place, and he was not able to serve due to football injuries he'd sustained while being an amateur football player. And so he went up to Seattle to try to get a job in Alaska with the Army Corps of Engineers. And so that's where he met my grandmother, who had his family had moved from Texas, her branch, up here to Seattle, and she was a student at UW. And it was they were very unlikely match. There was this 5'11" German woman and this 5'5" Native American man at a time when, it was still illegal in many states for that type of marriage or union to take place. So that's where, you know, eventually they went up to Alaska and came back down and settled on Bainbridge Island. And so that's why I was, you know, even though I was born in Tacoma, we moved and were kind of raised there for a little while. And then my father moved us to Puyallup. And, you know, I come from a divorced home. So my mother had moved to Seattle, which is the ceded lands of the Duwamish people. So I kind of moved around a lot within the Pacific Northwest territories. But over the years, you know, we've made reconnection with our vast amount of family from my grandfather's native side. You know, he had
correction. The Duwamish did not cede Seattle. It was taken.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. Absolutely. And so he, sorry, I lost my place. I lost track of where I was. That's okay. No, that's okay. It's important that you said that. So thank you. I just got in the role of saying ceded lands, but it is a very important point. And, you know, a big point of, I think, you know, part of these conversations is understanding that in this tapestry that, you know, of this area with these beautiful stories of, you know, peoples in motion, you know, they're powerful stories, stories of resilience, stories of resistance, you know, the pursuit of happiness. And part of that, of course, is, you know, kind of tucked underneath all these overlapping layers are stories of the first peoples, right? Which are also stories of resilience and resistance in spite of genocide, in spite of displacement. And so it is opportunities like today and being able to share these stories that brings visibility, you know, and honor to them. And it's vital to our humanity and to this revolution and to community building. And so I'll kind of, I guess, leave my intro there. And again, just say thank you for having me here and be part of today.
Thank you, future Dr. Aguilar. So glad that you are with us. Let's now go to Chris Jordan. Welcome. And if you would also share your story as well, Chris.
Hey, everybody. It's great to be here and great to be here along with these incredible panelists. I'm excited about the conversation that you're having. It's interesting, you know, when I look at my family's story in terms of migration, I see different energy sources. I know that sounds like real vague and woo-woo, but like, I think oftentimes we talk about Black folks and migration, we talk specifically just about displacement. We talk about migration as like a negative flow where we are being pulled in different places in different directions just for the sake of survival. But what I always find interesting about Black communities is that we also have a tendency to send for each other. When we go places, that we find ourselves, even with the relative degree of thriving, we send for relatives, for extended family, for extended community from other geographic areas in the country, knowing, hey, come build a life here. You can thrive here. We see opportunity here, and we want you to thrive as well. And that's a part of my family story. I feel like we were the last trickle, the final trickle of the great second wave of the Great Migration coming out this way. Like, my father is a pastor, and you know, shortly after being ordained, he felt led to support. There was a vacancy opening up in the ministry here in Tacoma, Washington. There's a small, tiny little white church across the street from Al Davies, which is a real old school church. The National Church was one of the, up until the 50s, was a church that did not have instruments. It was claps and congregational songs. We were old school. And so actually my grandma was the first organist in our national church organization, Church of God by Faith. But my father, shortly after being ordained in the early 80s, was called on to support this really small ministry here. The elder pastor was kind of aging out and needing support of a new generation. And him and my mom and my two oldest siblings hopped in the car and drove from literally the other corner of the country out this way from Florida. They were in, my mom's from Daytona Beach and my dad's from Cocoa Beach, Florida. And what I find so interesting about like that kind of dynamic in that story is, you know, I grew up in in a space where my church was my extended family. And we didn't have cousins out here. We didn't have those other things. It was our extended family. And in the Hilltop area, a lot of the property that that our church was connected to, that people would, you know, they had a home, they could make it available to someone. And this has been seen throughout the history of Hilltop, is elders who got a foothold economically, you know, after World War II, who are able to have some kind of land or some kind of property, to acquiring land to have homes and support other Black people who are moving in. Whereas, you know, in 2000, geez, what year was it? Our family's move away from Hilltop was a different kind of form of migration, I would say, where, you know, in the context of this neighborhood becoming increasingly gentrified, it's really tough. It's really tough. There's certain details that are hard to talk about. What I want to say about displacement and gentrification in Hilltop and people losing their homes is that oftentimes we talk just about the financial dimensions of that, but it's important to understand that like gender-based oppression and abuse and all other sorts of victimization also coincide with how people become displaced. And some of these parts of the story aren't like my story to tell in my family, but what I really want to stress is that it's all the forms of exploitation extend through all different kinds of intersection and forms of victimization. And we often don't talk about things like abuse. When we talk about gentrification, we often don't talk about things like that, but they're all a part of the story. And Black communities and Black families are facing so many different kinds of war on every side, it seems. But what also inspires me, and I loved hearing the term tapestry before, is how we bring the little pieces that we have together of community and we stitch them together where we go next. And that is what I see with my family. That is what I see in organizing alongside Kiara. And I'm excited today to talk about where those tapestries come from in our neighborhoods and in our communities with the other folks that are here. So yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Thank you. Really appreciate the tapestry this panel is creating and the various strands that you all are weaving together, not only with each other, but also with our readings, Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson and Parable of the Sower in a different kind of way, but very deep kind of way based in history. I want to go to our next question. And maybe we'll go in the same order, but let me ask you all, how does migration play a role in your life and in your work? And I'll go to you first, Dr. Morales.
Thank you, Dr. Zaragoza. Just write it down. I really want to say thank you to the other panelists for sharing. I really written some notes. I really love, I think it was Chris that you were talked about this notion of how we send for each other, how families send for each other. And so you just had this other kind of thinking of like the ways that, yeah, my family, like a lot of Mexican families, have left escaping things and in search of things, and because of the needs of labor and, you know, all these sorts of things. But there's also the ways that kind of changing the narrative is the ways that we send for each other to bring us on, right? And at least my generation was, right? We came up, right, for that. And then when we came to Washington State, it was my mom's brothers and sisters and parents saying, my mom, hey, y'all struggling in East Bay in California because we couldn't make a living. So they sent for us, right? So we came up to Washington, right? So I appreciate that. So how does migration sort of impact me, my story with immigration? Anthony's a question. In every way, and in my personal, in my professional, and my academic frameworks, right? It's not just a quote unquote study, right, or a discipline or something that I study, that I teach about, that I incorporate and interweave in the classroom, in the teaching with students, learning with students, right? It has created a framework and how I see the world, right? I think about, even if I'm looking at issues of questions of, studying education, I think about it as from the perspective of someone that, as I think it was Kendra, we talked about kind of being in motion, right? People in motion, right? And so that's like my own framework, how I approach everything that I teach. When I sit and listen to students' stories about their own movements and their own migrations, my experience, my journey as an immigrant myself, and the memories and stories of my parents and grandparents and great-grandparents helps me better understand and empathize with those students, right? It impacts the ways that I read political discourse, right? Immigration, not just in this current administration, of the past immigration, keeps on being a central topic of conversation, right? And so it's through my stories, I use my stories. I try to use my stories in our classrooms to invite students, to invite us all to sort of unpack those narratives, those very limiting and incomplete stories that are told about who immigrant people are, particularly from Mexico. I think, it's really important to say that I certainly don't speak for like the experience of the immigrant person or the experience of the Latinx or the Latin American immigrant. It's different for all of us, right? So someone that comes from Mexico, right? That has a country that has a long relationship with the United States, right? It's been really complicated. That's where I speak from. So it's really important for me to share my own stories of experience, to my own memories of crossing the border as a 5-year-old child, right? The interviews and what I've learned from my grandfather when I sit with him and he's talked to me about coming to Washington State in the 1970s and 80s and working in Yakima and Quincy. And when he decided that it was time to bring his family and when they came to settle in the 1990s, right? Or when I hear stories of what he knew about his father being in Indiana and working in the steel, right? Sharing those stories with students is super important because it's me, it's my human self, right? It's not just my professional self, it's who I am, right? My relationship to land and movements. Like now, it's always something that I think about. Like I am here in Washington. What does it mean to make home in this land, in this territory, when my home is like sort of what I carry with me, what my family has always carried with us, right? And so it's impacts my approaches, the ways I read, again, political discourse, and use my stories to interrupt that, to push back, to provide counter narratives, and in so doing, hoping that students can themselves bring up their own stories, either of immigration or the ways that they read immigration from their own standpoints and how they may not have a direct relationship to it. So it's what I study, it's what I look at. So it's also who I am, right? An immigrant. I am, some scholar named it a 1.5 generation immigrant, right? Which is a very particular generation, right? Being the first generation, right? Someone that crossed the border, right? Second generation, you're here, but your parents crossed the border. But a 1.5 generation immigrant speaks to the difference in a 5-year-old like me, who yes, I am first generation because I crossed the US-Mexico border, but I was raised in the United States. I lived here, I went to school here, I was schooled here. And that's different from a 15-year-old crossing the border who went to school in Mexico, right? So naming that very like specificity of our experiences and not really trying to speak for the grander, there's no kind of the big, right? Speaking for all the immigrants experience. We're all our stories are different, so they very much intersect. And it's so important to shed light on all of those and all those complexities to really push back against the dehumanizing narratives of immigration and all the tropes and all the ways that caricatures are created in political discourse, right? The bad hombre, the bad this, right? Or the felon, and the, there's just all caricatures. So our stories and the ways that impacts me is it really motivates me to tell those stories in authentic ways, and starting with my own lived experience.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Morales. And I wanna, I'm gonna go to Kiara Daniels in just a second, but I want to invite two things from our learning community. One, if you have questions, we're gonna move to learning community questions. If you have questions, please send them to me in a direct message in the chat. If you're unable to do that, let me know. And also, if you are able to, if you can and feel comfortable, I just want to encourage all those who can to come onto the screen so our panelists can see our learning community and we can at least have a photo stamp size picture-to-picture experience. So if you can, I want to just invite folks to come on and be with us. Thank you for those who are able to. I know that not everybody is, so thank you. And I'm going to go to you now, Kiara. Thank you again for being with us.
Absolutely. So, okay, your question was about how migration plays a role in our life and in our work. And for me, migration is not state to state, right? I've been in here for 30 years, but just in Tacoma alone, I've had to move maybe 4 times in my lifetime, right? Which is actually not a lot compared to other people that I've known. When my grandmother died, she left my family 2 houses, one on 25th and Yakima, and the other in Central Tacoma, which actually is a little bit mind-blowing that a single lady had 2 houses, owned 2 houses on her own. I need to get more information about how that happened, but I don't even know that that was fully legal. Like, I feel like I'm missing some parts of the story here. But anyway, so the house on 25th and Yakima oversaw the entire downtown. It had a beautiful, beautiful view. And my aunt, the city came to her, and I think it was the city, it might've been the housing authority, and said they wanted to buy that land and that she could live elsewhere. And so she packed her family up and they moved to the bordering of the east side, south side. And my mom, we lived in our house for almost 20 years in Central Tacoma on 19th by Foss. And we lost that house in 2008 in the housing crash. And that absolutely devastated our entire family. That was the house that, first of all, everybody in our family took turns living there when they didn't have a place to live. That was where we had our parties. That was where we gathered. That was where we created culture, because it was the only place that was big enough to fit all of us. And so not having a place to gather was truly devastating beyond the financial trauma that it caused, having a house foreclosed on you. So that really fueled my desire to learn about housing and my desire to learn about how things like this happen, right? So at the time, I'm at Evergreen and I'm learning all of these things about gentrification. I'm doing my spring project on gentrification, and I'm just getting interested, and even more interested, I'm going to Oakland and watching how gentrification is happening there. And I'm like, yo, this is crazy. This is happening right here in Tacoma, and we are just, nobody's doing anything about it, it feels like, right? So circle back, we're probably like 8 years later now. And really the things that I knew that were gonna come, the things that we saw in every other city, every other growing city happen. And it's frustrating, it's really frustrating, right? I wish I would have known what I knew now about how to stop that and how to be involved and how to be engaged in policy choices. So that really laid the groundwork for my work. I care about housing. I'll let Chris talk about Design the Hill and what we're doing with housing. But the sadness that comes from losing your place is not just your house. It is the institutions in your neighborhood. It's the art in your neighborhood. It's the businesses in your neighborhood. And those are like the lifeblood that really, really sadden people when they lose their home and their connection to their community, right? And so one of the things that we don't hear a lot about when we talk about gentrification, we talk about residential housing, which is absolutely a huge part of it. But we don't talk about what happens when our favorite businesses are gone, right? The Hilltop used to be a Black business district, and there are very few of them left. So what happens when you go to your neighborhood, the sadness that comes to you when you see a Whole Foods and you see golly, the new juice stand that has replaced your family-owned businesses, right? So that's where my work really comes in, finding those resources on not only how to keep the businesses there that are there, but how do we bring back and how do we encourage our young Black folks to innovate and create new businesses, because the people that were there, we're not going to be able to get them back. They're grown now. They're not going to come back and start another business. So we have to figure out how to foster and support as the area grows. And that's really where my day work is focused. And I'll let Chris tell the rest about Design the Hill and where else we kind of focus.
Great. I'm going to go then right to you, Chris. Thank you so much. And it's incredible to see the connections you're also making with Warmth of Other Suns and the things that Black folks were experiencing in the South continue to happen in new and other forms and under new names in the places that so many folks arrived at. So I appreciate that insight, Kiara. Chris, let's go to you and then we'll go to Kendra.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so interesting because freedom of movement is such a concept to think about when it comes to Black people in general. And as I think about this dynamic of migration, the different natures of how people end up moving and why, it just brought to mind for me how oftentimes we talk about segregation versus integration as this thing about, are people allowed to go to this grocery store or allowed to, I don't know, have some real weird stuff, things about diners and things like that. When really and truly understanding segregation is a white supremacist system of policing folks' movements. It's literally about policing where people are able to be, how they're able to be, where they physically can be located, and particularly, using folks' skin as a meter, as a metric for where they can be allowed to exist. And so I want to name that because I really see a lot of our work with Design the Hill as being about stopping the cycle of forced migration and stopping those cycles, you know what I mean, and disrupting the ways that forced migration, which really is this interconnection between Native folks' experiences, Black folks' experiences, immigrant experiences. It's a chain of migration, forced migration, that interlinks our communities, or interlinks our experiences, I'll say. And I think that our work is absolutely about stopping that. And part of what's the challenge is really just shifting this discourse around what segregation is and what it was, and because when we fight to create communities that honor our existence, that honor our space, that honor our home, and we co-construct home together, oftentimes what's levied against us is this idea that we're segregating ourselves, right? So whiteness has this tendency to fluctuate, whenever it's threatened, whenever it's challenged, in terms of power. And it'll shift from this race aware system to this race blind system. It'll shift the language, it'll reverse the polarities it'll switch the game up on you completely. And now having a Black neighborhood, or trying to create space for Black folks to live and thrive together and support one another, can be described as being segregationist or, you know, being exclusive or being, so it's so crazy. It's so crazy the kind of things that people do. But I really feel like our work with Design the Hill is about disrupting those cycles of forced migration by supporting our community to shape its own destiny. And, you know, it's really interesting how it kind of evolved. There's been a long tradition of Black community organizers in the Hill fighting to disrupt these cycles by by kind of empowering residents to take ownership of homes from absentee landlords, empowering them for labor to actually repair and reconstruct and build those homes, and to work on each other's homes and take that ownership and take that value and build stability. And I think that there's no way to me to comprehend like the legacy, for example, of Evergreen and the legacy of the Hilltop neighborhood as interconnected without recognizing the housing activism that underlies how this community has been able to come into existence. What I see Design the Hill is doing is continuing that rich legacy by supporting young people to have an active part in helping shape the neighborhood's future. And really, when it's so funny because I don't want to take 30 minutes right now ranting about it, but I guess the key message is that there's no coincidence when you look at how the forces that are displacing us and the industries that are connected to that. You have all these tech folks moving in, coming down from Seattle, buying up property en masse. And you have, you know, these white engineers, architects, folks who make decisions about city planning, infrastructure that will go into our neighborhoods and make decisions about where we'll live and how. And the question that we asked at Design the Hill was like, well, if it takes 4 years to plan this light rail going down the street, in 4 years, a young person moves from being a sophomore in high school to a sophomore in college. Why is it that we can't empower our young people to be a part of this, of designing our future and create a pathway for them that reinvents and reimagines what design is? Why is it that we can't empower our young folks as engineers, as planners, as designers to create new paradigms of design and community development, to glean from and reinvest from and replant the knowledge and the fruit that our elders have borne for us? And that's why we connect. That's why we collaborate. That's why we talk. I think by next year, we'll be approaching 500 units of community-based designed housing that has been done centering Black folks in Hilltop. You know, and so it's just like, it's mind-boggling that this could come out of just, you know, of just passionate community members like Kiara, like Tara Williams, like Kenya, who's here, like coming together and talking about what we need. But there's so much that we can do. And it's not just about Hilltop, it's really about changing how we do land and housing in Tacoma.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you for your work and congratulations on that work, very important work. And congratulations, thank you for both you and Kiara, making new connections for us among both of our texts. You've just shown a whole new light on our readings in such an important way. And I really want to just highlight that and thank you for that. I'm going to go to Kendra Aguilar to answer this question. How does migration play a role in your life and your work? I have a question after that from Horacio, and anyone else who wants to ask questions, please let me know in the chat. Kendra, go ahead.
So I guess I want to mirror the sentiments expressed by Dr. Morales about the importance of you know, telling our own stories and why we need our voices and your voices, all your voices and stories to be brought to the table. It's important that we control the narrative of our own experiences so that we're not misrepresented or erased, continuing to be erased, made invisible. You know, and a perfect example is earlier when I was, you know, kind of giving my intro, and, you know, I had a slip of the tongue when I meant to say unceded territories of Duwamish and said seated. And I really do appreciate that we took the moment to address that. But that's a perfect example of where that's not my story. You know, and then of course, trying to do honor to that story, I misspoke. And that's a perfect example of why we need to tell our own stories. And, you know, I'll say, you know, English is not one of my ancestral languages for any of my ancestors. And I find even now, even after, you know, for some of my ancestors, they've been working with that language for multiple generations, and for others, it's just one, you know. So I still find though, after, you know, even being born into that language, that it doesn't flow from my mouth the way I know my ancestral languages would. And I find myself struggling more and more with expressing myself in the English language. And so one of the things that I've done, and I guess how migration's impacted my life, one of the ways, you know, in my doctoral journey, I started trying to learn my ancestral, you know, language, my Luiseño language. And you know, there's a lot of complications with that. One of it being that, you know, as far as how I express my indigeneity is very linked to migration, because, you know, my grandfather, as I said, he was orphaned at a young age and sent to Indian boarding school where language and culture was stripped from him. And there are times in this country where it was illegal for Native folks to express their religion or any aspects of their culture. And because of migration, so like I said, he graduated from that school and there was no work for him in California. Although for a short period of time, he was actually a stand-in for some famous actors of the time in Hollywood, because Hollywood would hire Native folks. So that's a whole nother story for another time. But so, you know, he moved around a lot and ended up here in the Pacific Northwest, and he was not present at the time that the tribe took a particular census roll that they decided to use to determine their citizenship for the tribe. And because he was not physically present to be counted, our family has been erased from tribal rolls. So we are currently not enrolled. And not everybody probably has a big background in understanding and what that means and how tribal self-determination is done. But for federally recognized tribes and for Native folks, being an enrolled citizen of your nation, it not only has impact as far as you know, I guess what I'll say is it really impedes, it can impede a sense of belonging. It's very complicated, and that's also a story for another time. I do teach classes about this topic, about blood quantum and about citizenship and self-determination as expressions of sovereignty. You know, but for me, it's not being enrolled really impacts how I move in my communities. And it has impacted over time my sense of belonging in Indigenous spaces. At this time in my life, you know, I've gone through my identity awakening journeys and, you know, kind of made peace with that. But, you know, because I now call this area and these lands home, it's where I was born and raised. You know, my family has made and built community with all sorts of folks. And, you know, our stories, I love how you say it, Chris, and, you know, how our experiences are interlinked. Our peoples, our communities have always been interlinked, and there's some complex stories there, some really complex stories there, especially between and among, you know, Black folks and Native folks. And it's something that we haven't talked about enough. And my husband is Afro-Indigenous, he's Black and Native, his tribe's from the East Coast. He was raised here in Seattle, and his father was very active with the Dixon family and the Panthers. But he also, being Native, was very active with Bernie White Bear and the urban Native folks in this area, which is part of our story as well. You know, without going into a huge history lesson, you know, we think about what was happening during the time that Tacoma was what they would say founded, right? In, I guess, 1870-ish. You know, the Dawes Act, the Federal Indian Policy of 1887, which is what was set to really, you know, terminate tribes. And Native folks were displaced and put on reservations, and then the lands were sold off, and all this stuff happened, you know, kind of leading into, you know, all this migration that happened to the Northwest with the gold rush and the railroads and all this industry. You know, the civil rights movement, you know, starting in the early 1950s, overlapped with the termination era, where the government tried to terminate tribes once again by relocating Native folks to various cities throughout the country. And Seattle and Tacoma were two of those cities that were chosen for that program. And they basically gave Native folks one-way tickets to these areas and promised jobs and, you know, all these other things. And then when they got here, there was no support. So Native folks band together to create their own support, but Native and Black communities came together to support one another in various ways. And, you know, the civil rights movement sparked the American Indian movement. And so we owe a great deal, you know, to our Black relatives for leading the way in that. And, you know, that kind of moved into locally with the Puyallup tribe, you know, the fish wars of the 1960s, and then the occupation of Fort Lawton in the 70s. And, you know, that, you know, was all happening right as, you know, right before and right as, you know, Evergreen-Tacoma was coming about. So, you know, up in Seattle currently, so besides also, you know, teaching for Evergreen and in the Native Pathways program, where we have Native students who are from local tribes, as well as, you know, people who were displaced through these, like the termination and relocation era of the government. And we're all coming together and trying to, you know, kind of make sense of where our stories interlink and find our place of belonging, whether these are your lands and your ancestral lands or not. They're where we live. It's where we call home now. And so needing to build the relationship with the lands. And that's something we talk about with our students a lot, is that, you know, we talk about how we miss our homelands or our ancestral lands, but the lands also miss us. And, but this being our home, it's all of our responsibility to build a relationship with the lands that we call home. And, or anywhere we travel or anywhere we go, it's our responsibility to build relationship with those lands. And so I hope that through that process, we can, you know, it can be a start for a healing place, right? Because there's a lot of healing work to do, or repair work to do amongst our communities. And it really came out recently. This will be kind of the last thing I say about my work, is I am one of the directors on the board of Families of Color Seattle, and have been for this my 3rd year now. You know, in this past summer with everything going on, you know, a lot of conversations came out. There was some amazing, beautiful expressions of leadership and resistance happening right here in our city and where I live in Seattle. But through that, you know, a lot of the pain started emerging. The pain that has been buried in that tapestry, right? The threads that have been kind of covered up with all the layers, or, you know, moved to the corners or the margins. And it started being seen and kind of coming to the surface. And that's where a lot of the pain of where experiences have had intersections that we need to discuss. We need to talk about Native American, you know, the slavery of Black folks in Native American history and the anti-Blackness, you know, that is very alive and well today. And we have to talk about it, and we have to take it from the shadows, right, and put it into the light so that we can do the work that needs to be done. And so that's the type of work I've been doing with folks. And that's the type of work we do in our classrooms with our students. But it starts with our stories. So again, I just really thank you for this opportunity to start sharing some of those stories.
Thank you, Kendra. Yes, absolutely. It starts with our stories. Thank you so much for sharing some of yours and some of your families. I want to just let folks know where we're at. We have 3 questions from our community, our learning community. I think that's what we have time for. So I'm gonna, we'll ask those 3 questions, those folks, then we'll do our give back, and then we'll take a break. Let's go to Horacio for your question. Thank you, Horacio. Go ahead.
Thank you. My question is directed at Doctora Morales and Kendra. And congratulations, Kendra, on being on the track later on. Much luck to you. This one's kind of a little everywhere. I'm still kind of feeling in the middle of it, but it's concerning identity. So I was born here. Both my parents are from Mexico. My dad from Veracruz and my mom from Zacatecas. And growing up here, I guess I always felt like a sort of dissonance. And I know that this isn't like an uncommon thing to feel as a child of immigrants. But I think it became more and more emphasized, more and more focused, I guess. As I grew up and I started to ask like the deeper questions, as I started to get into like the government forums, as I started to like ask myself who I was and where I came from, and you know, as like the census came up this year, and I thought I had like a somewhat of a good understanding of what I could put down on paper at least, right? And I see the categories, and it asks you first, like, are you Hispanic or Latino, right? It's like, oh, okay, I'll pick one of them. And then the next question is like, are you white, Black, or Asian? And I was like, what? Like, I'm neither of those, you know, or I'm none of those. And then there's the other, and like when I circled in the other, like or like the other one is Native American, but like when I circled in the other, I felt such a, I don't know, such like a, I don't know, just that feeling of dissonance happening again. And like that feeling of like, what am I? Like, what do I even, yeah, just what am I? And it's not like it was my first time encountering that form, but I think it was my first time really like reflecting on all of the work that I've already done and understanding that there is still so much left to do. Because I have like wrestled, and I still do. I still do wrestle with like terms like mestizaje. I still do wrestle with terms like with this Hispanic and Latinx, you know, and Chicanismo. Like some of them, like coming from like Spanish colonial case systems, right? Like where a lot of times we call ourselves these terms because we don't want to look at the indigenous parts of ourselves. We don't want to look at those parts of ourselves because they told us that they were ugly, because they told us that they needed to be weeded out. And Latinx and Hispanic, well, because like it's a more nice term for the Europeans. And Chicanismo, like that's like now I'm putting myself in like a world that is like that I'm presuming like the borders of the United States are correct, you know, and it's and everything that I try to call myself, it's just like what, like that's not it, you know, because like I'm accepting some type of like control over my life, and it's not even control like from my own community or like words from my own community. It's like control from like this. Chris, you had put it like perfectly. It's control from like a white supremacist point of view, and so, yeah, it wasn't really a question. I think it was just like a testimony, I guess. But I think there's just like, I just wanted to say there's like so much work to be done within like people who look like me, who look like us, who think like us. And just being able to look at yourself and loving yourself, loving the parts of yourself that your parents thought like were ugly, that your parents were like, oh no, like salió prieto, you know, he came out brown, or like salió blanquita, like blanquita, she came out a little white, so she's gonna end up a little bit like better in life, you know. But yeah.
Thank you, Horacio. I'm going to turn this beautiful testimonio over to our panelists and ask for a response. We then have a question from Ashley Jones and a question from Anthony Tackett. Please go ahead, panelists.
Horacio, if I may, first, thank you so much for your willingness and your courage to share your testimony, as Dr. Shepherd says in the chat. It's excellent critical inquiry, I agree. And I think it's also just a reminder of how very similar our stories are, even if we have different journeys and different trajectories, right? And I completely feel what you're speaking to, Horacio. I remember being in college and being like, wait a minute. So Hispanic, right? And then Latino. And then I went to Chicano studies class and I learned, and then the term Chicanismo did something to me that I had never experienced, right? Like it was like it brought something alive, right? And open possibilities. But then I was like, but wait a minute, that doesn't fully encompass who I am and my story, right? And then I was like, well, I reject it all. And I certainly went, and I'm still grappling with that, with sort of the different identity terms and possibilities, right? And I think where I arrived, my response to what you're saying is that I think all of these terms, certainly we have to engage with them critically, right? They have these histories, as you said, really beautifully, right? A lot of them come from and just reflect these like case systems that are not historical, but very much still live in our stories and our bodies. Specifically what you're naming, Horacio, this rejection of indigeneity that we feel in our families, right? Like I totally have heard oh, you know, pareces indita. My mom has told me that. And I was like, you know, you look like a little native, right? And I remember sitting with her and be like, why did you say that, right? And that's not historical, that's now, right? Like that active rejection of brown and dark skin, and particularly indigenous stories and histories. Even though we see it in our food and what we eat and what we identify with, right? And what's safe for us to eat. Like we see it in the tortillas we roll up every day when we eat with our frijoles, right? We see it in like what we celebrate and how we celebrate. We see it, we hear it in the stories we tell, but we don't quote unquote admit that that's who we are, right? And it's a lot to unpack, and it could be really heavy, really heavy. And I think for me, what I have come to is that a lot of these terms are just very much constructions, right? Latinx sort of emerged very recently. Like, what does that mean? And I certainly don't want somebody to be like, you are Latinx, just like I wouldn't want somebody else to sort of like, you are this, right? It's like, let me tell you my own story, right? And I think that all of these terms are constructed, yes, within certain like politics, just like Chicano kind of emerged during a time of resistances and like people in youth being like, let's have more possibilities and let's reclaim, right? And I think there are constructions, but they offer us different possibilities. And it's really like what we want to connect to, right? And me telling you my story that I am Mexican, I am born in Mexico, but I'm not necessarily like, you know, sort of the same national as like Mexicana, right? Like, but like I'm also connected to Chicanismo in the ways that it speaks to my identity, right? And yet at the same time, I teach Latinx studies, right? And like, it's not one or the other. It can be all, right? I could sort of take from all these things. And I think it's, you know, like, people could connect to in the whatever identities terms they feel comfortable with, what aligns with their stories. Like I don't want to tell others and my students, no, you should really consider Chicano because it actually does this. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about where that emerged in those stories, and then we select what align to who we are and to who our stories are, and be really critical of all of them, right? And critical doesn't mean that we just sort of like, you know, reject, but it's like, okay, so what is Chicano, what is Chicanx, what is Latino? Where did that come from? Who kind of created it? What stories is it speaking to? What stories is it not speaking to? And then when we get all of that, And then we select like, yeah, I want to mark this or not. I'm gonna just mark it all, right? So it is complicated, and in your testimonio just kind of, really provides a counter narrative to the very, to that simplistic sort of idea of like identity, and like, or specifically when it's addressing, I think, Latin American communities and stories that are so much more complicated, right, than these terms kind of speak to. And the last thing I'll say to that, Horacio, is that I think that addresses the sense of belonging that Kendra, you were speaking to, that we all sort of have, right, kind of long for. When Kiara and Chris are talking about kind of these spaces and communities and the loss that you feel when buildings are taken, like as an immigrant, I've never felt that, because I haven't been in a place long enough to say, I connect to these buildings. Like I only have that in my memories and the stories, right, of like the lands. I don't have that relationship because we moved around so much, because I've moved around so much, right? So I think I made sense of it by saying, well, I may not relate to this land in that same way, but as Kendra said, like, I want to be able to get to know where I live, but I do have all the stories in my pack, right? And my stories I carry home with me, right? As Gloria Anzaldúa beautifully wrote in Borderlands, right? We carry homes with us, and that's our experiences, Horacio. And that's just been my experience, carrying home with me, and then learning how to relate with not just identity in terms, but with each other in the places that I live. Right now I live in Tacoma, so I want to learn how to better understand Tacoma and relate, because this is where I am, but I am also of all of these other places and stories, right?
Yeah, I often say that there's a world of stories on a grocery shelf where corn tortillas sit next to flour tortillas, right? Which is some of what you're talking about, no doubt. And also, Dr. Shepard and I had the good fortune of being on the hiring committee that hired Dr. Morales. And we had lots of conversations about what to call that position, Horacio, that mirror and mimic the dialogue that you have been having with Dr. Morales. So it is one that is very current and very real. So thank you for sharing. I want to turn to the other panelists and see if Kendra, Kiara, Chris want to respond to Horacio as well. We have a couple of other questions. And Karen Akuya, I also see your hand. We've got Ashley and Anthony coming up as well.
I don't want to belabor the point, because I feel like, Doctor, you just did an amazing job. I would just tell you my own super quick experience and trying to decide if I want to be called a Black person, an African-American, an African, Pan-African. Like, it really never mattered specifically to me until or a person of color, a BIPOC, any of the million things that we have right now to call ourselves. It only actually mattered to me when I started looking at the data, and when we allowed ourselves to just be called people of color, then we see how many resources go to people of color, and how many resources get left out from Black folks, right? And so there's this, recently I see in our community, there's this movement or this momentum to say it loud: you are Black, you are, you're not just a person of color, which there's so many different colors and so many different, things that go along with that, but we are Black people, and we are allowed to say that, and we are allowed to claim that if we do something or if we have a resource, it is for Black people, right? And that's not because nobody else matters, it's because it's been demonized just to say you're Black for so long, right? And so for me, trying to get comfortable and trying to get to lose the fear of just saying that I am a Black person. I am also a person of color, but I am a Black person. And the work that I do is for Black people, which ultimately helps all people of color and everyone else too. But the work that we're doing right now is for Black people. And I have to be okay saying that, because if I can't say that, we'll never get anywhere, right? And so I just identify so much with what you're saying, and how feeling like all these labels are just things that white folks have just put on you, and yes, it is a journey, and I'm on it too.
Panelists, should I move on to the next question so we can get some more in? Or is there someone that really wants to speak to that? Okay, thank you. I'm going to go to Ashley's question. Ashley asks, and this is specifically for Kiara and Chris, how does your work of Design the Hill expand to other neighborhoods in Tacoma? And by that, Ashley means South Tacoma, East Side. Will other resources be available to other neighborhoods experiencing gentrification? And has your work inspired other cities? Fantastic question, Anthony. Ashley, sorry.
That's such a good question. It's funny because there's two sides, I think, multiple sides to the answer. I mean, on the one hand, having the courage to commit culturally to this like Black cultural epicenter, which has been so violently erased in our city, in our community landscape. It's really important that there are geographic areas for community members to identify with and connect with. That's why Hilltop has been so central to so many of us. I could go into so much more detail about that, but I like, it's a big deal. And so I think part of it is understanding that unless Black people are able to exist in space, the world is less safe for everybody, and that our city is really at a loss. Our community at large is at a loss when Black people are not allowed to exist and be supported to have space. But it's so interesting because whenever we try to put the focus on Hilltop or as a Black cultural epicenter, it's immediately targeted as like, well, what about this, or what about that, or what about this, or what about that? But what's strange is like, nobody says the opposite. When you go to like another cultural enclave in Tacoma, people don't say, well, why isn't there a Black that, right? It's not the knee-jerk reaction. And so it's like unpacking a lot of that is a big part of our work. And like Kiara said, people having the courage to say Black, it's literally like in the past, I would say 16 months have been some of the first times where I've heard some of our public officials who run like our housing agencies and things like that be willing to say Black, like literally say the word Black.
That has been a journey in its own, just to literally get anyone to say Black people.
it's work. So like just understanding where we are in this continuum of work, and obviously like that connects back to like this, like, generationally back to the Black Power movement and our folks organizing and having the determination to collectively argue for and activate like, no, this is who we are, and taking courage and pride. And that's a moment where Black moved from being a race to being articulated as an ethnicity and a specific experience. And so, I mean, this kind of goes a little, I've been trying to not deal with Horacio's question because there's so many different parts about this, like naming and privilege and choice, right? And agency and how we are identified versus like non-agency and how we're identified, and differentiating race and ethnicity and all these things. And like Black people are inherently racialized in white supremacy because that is what capitalism is built on. If Black people are not racialized and unambiguously understood as being Black, capitalism cannot stand, right? So whether you refer to us as Negroes, whether you refer to us as slaves, whatever language you use, Black people must be named. We must be unambiguously recognized and nameable so that we can be targeted, so that we can be tracked, so that we can be sequestered, so that we can be suppressed. Like, it's necessary. It's different form of targeting than other kinds of erasure that other communities experience. And those are also extremely violent and extremely how capitalism is built, right? So they're different forms, but just knowing that But what I want to say is that it's so important that there's Black space. And so there's a legal way how we build an infrastructure of like communities being able to have self-determination in Tacoma, and this work absolutely echoes out to, you know, South Tacoma, like having like largest population density, fewest parks, least amount of like you know, certain kinds of like healthcare infrastructure and other kinds of support. And really, when Black folks were displaced from Hilltop, they ended up in the Tacoma Mall area, you know, which is now facing just new levels of kind of people being priced out and pushed out. So understanding like our whole landscape is being is eroded when Black people don't have space, when there's no trunks and trees that hold together this like this community. So everyone's more vulnerable when Black people are being disrupted. And that's partially also, I'll just last say this, is that it's the most lucrative. Our space is lucrative because of anti-Blackness, our space is devalued. And so it creates the largest margins of flipping and development. So without the kinds of profit margins that can be attained through whitewashing and gentrifying Black space, those kinds of violence don't have the opportunity to also move through spaces that are cultural enclaves for other communities. And so it's all connected and it all must be fought for. Sorry if that was like more of a theoretical answer than a practical one, but the practical work is happening, and just hit us up or come to one of our Design the Hill meetings, you'll see it.
I want to ask the panelists permission to move on to the next question. Is that okay with you all? Okay, thank you. I'm going to now turn to Anthony Tackett. Anthony, come on and ask your question.
All right. Thank you all for stepping up for this conversation. It's been really healthy. My question is, as we observe similar patterns that cause our ancestors to migrate north, what's the ultimate indicator for you? And this is a general question. What's the ultimate indicator for you that it may be time to migrate again? And my follow-up is, my family migrated here from Boeing, my mom and dad's side. And that's how they met, similar stories to some of you. My follow-up is, where would we go if it was the case that it was time to migrate? Do we follow the tech boom and find like Elon Musk's home, like our ancestors, we find technology, we go to his house and say, give us work? Or do we find our own community and rebuild again?
Thank you for that, Anthony. And you are bridging our two texts incredibly well. So thank you for that question. Panelists?
Unmute. Hi. Hi, Anthony. Thank you for that question. You know, what comes to mind for me when I think about, you know, like signs, it might be time to migrate again, and where and how, what would it look like? You know, for me, what I experience is a call to return home. And it's very complicated, you know, because they're lands that I have only just started over the years to build and rebuild a relationship with. But, you know, we have a genetic memory, you know, and I think that, you know, we try to carry pieces of home with us through our foods, through songs, art, music, through story sharing. But, you know, I definitely feel that, yet I think about what would be the lands that I would return to. Like, what does that even mean for me anymore? You know, I have ancestors from all parts of the globe, and I want to honor all of my ancestors, you know, in my identity. So yeah, it can be really complex, and for a lot of folks, and this is true, it's for all peoples, you know, we have different reasons why we might not know where home is, right? I mean, due to slavery, people don't know where their homelands are. Due to, you know, the removal of Native children from their homes and communities, we don't know where our homelands are. due to transracial adoption. We don't know where our homelands are, on and on and on. And so that's where, you know, I kind of think about it in wherever we choose to live and to be. And it reminds me again of what you're saying, Dr. Morales, with carrying your stories, right? Like in a backpack, like with you. And just again saying, wherever you are, take a moment to lay your stories down in that place and introduce yourself to those lands and introduce your ancestors to the ancestors of those lands, you know, through your story. Like, make an introduction, and create your own sense of belonging. I know that doesn't exactly answer your question, but that's just kind of what it brought up for me.
And if I might jump in, Anthony, something you said, Kendra, reminded me of one of the biggest lessons I've learned, and kind of more recently within this thinking of migration, is for a long time I thought about the right to migrate and how migration is a right, kind of the right to move, right? But recently, sort of some of the work that I've been doing with Indigenous folks in Oaxaca, youth, children, and families, is how that we also have the right to stay, right? And the right to not migrate, right? And I've been really grappling with that. And so where I am in my journey is, this is home where I am. My family is all here. My abuelos are all here. But there has been this call, and it wasn't kind of something that I thought it would happen, but it did. I've been brought back to Mexico, and like the work that I've been doing in Oaxaca, and I have this call to go to Michoacan and like look at like my family's stories. And it just, I think it connects to this, not just that we sort of are pulled back home, but like the people at home, like this organizing and all that are doing all this work so that folks could recognize that they have a right to stay. They don't have to leave, right? They don't have to leave across the border or leave, right? Because migration happens within the country as well, not just, you know, between Mexico and the United States. There's a lot of migrations happening between Oaxaca and Cancun, right? Because it's a big touristy place, right? And I think there's something there that like that's what I've been grappling with these last couple of years. Like, what does that mean in terms of like my own quest, my own journey to belong, right? To like make home of where I am, but also not just connect to the lands that I do come, could I still have this need and this longing to connect, right? And I've been just kind of stepping back and letting those stories of people in Mexico teach me about that, what it means to stay, and how that really has been helping me connect these different parts in terms of like my own identity and experience.
Other panelists want to answer this, or should we move to the next question? Go ahead, Kiara.
I would just say that, you know, when I think about this, I think, you know, I lead a group of people who I think everybody expects to have, just in the neighborhood alone, right? There's about 12, 15 of us, and everybody expects, because we're Black people, that we are a monolith and we all have the same ideas about how to move forward. And let me tell you, I know this is why you asked the question, right? Like, we haven't even made it there. Like, we don't know what we're going to do. We don't know if we're Indigenous. We don't know if we want to go back to Africa. We don't know if we want to go back to the South. We don't know if we want to go to the East Coast. We don't know if we want to stay here and try to make this work out, because we've been here. We helped build this, right? Like, we are just right in the thick of just beginning to try to gather ourselves to even talk about what the plan is forward. And thus far, the issue has been just gathering and being able to, with all the hurt and all of everything that we have, the elders, the youngers, like, if we could just gather in a space, or in however we gather, right? Just to have the conversation and address all of the things that we're bringing to it. I don't know that we'll ever decide where we're going to go or what it is that we're going to do. That is like a dream. But what I know is that we got to try something with what we got here. And then if we decide after that we don't want to do it anymore, we're going back to Tanzania, we're going wherever. I'm on board, but I want to try to do what we could do with what we have here, because we invested here, we built this, like we did a lot to contribute to this, and I'm not giving up on it that easy. And so the answer is that, we're still arguing about it. So that's what, but what happens in the house stays in the house, and we know that. So I won't go too far much into that.
Thank you all for those answers. We've got 2 more questions, and I definitely want to reserve time for give back. Let's do this. Let's have both of the folks ask their questions, and then the panelists can answer one or both as quickly as possible. Karen, can you quickly ask your question? And then Adrian, can you follow up with yours?
Hello,
Go ahead, Akuya.
everybody. Can y'all hear me?
Yes.
Hello, Evergreen family. You know, when we were talking about the search really for our own identities and being able to do that journey, I took time in 2019 because I was in search of footprints of African American community here on Bainbridge Island. And I know, Kendra, you know this region, and the footprints of African Americans here has been totally erased, as if we have never existed here. But as I began to do my research, I went all the way back to the 1700s and back to the 1800s, and was found out in 1855 that it said native slaves and Asians were removed from the island to what is now called the Suquamish land. And so, I said, where are we? Where's our grave sites? Where did they put our bones? So I searched the grave sites, knowing that, and found that one of the oldest grave sites on the island belongs to a Black man and his daughter. And so I said, so all of this history has been totally erased. And because you lived here, Kendra, that many of our children of color are really struggling with their identities and struggling with, assimilating. And what does that mean? When we talk about the internalized oppression and the internalized dissonance that we do to ourselves and to our children when they grow up in dominantly white supremacist environments, and all of the internalized things that we have to talk about. When Horatio was talking about his identity, and when Ms. Morales talking about these struggles and all of these different things, until we begin to heal the land and heal our own histories. Those are internalized pieces we have to do for ourselves as we begin to think, as we move forward to do this work, the work that has to be done within our own communities of color and our own indigenous people. We come from indigenous people. I said, when I began my search and I went back to Ghana, I went back to Africa, I said, I come from a stolen people brought to a stolen land, and all of our histories are so interwoven, but yet we still come from that colonizing and oppressive lens that we even divide ourselves, and not even understanding the depth of the what has been done and what we have experienced through our migrations and through our history and through all of our experience, our lived in experience. And so until we can begin to have those conversations about what has happened to us and how to heal us as we move forward to do this work, I think we'll continue to do this continual, what I call it is perpetuating those oppressive, colonizing, languaging. And we say, oh, what we want to call ourselves. Well, we struggle with it because we've been called so many things that was unacceptable within our own histories. So you know, we dealing with you know, transforming the mindsets of who we are, even as we begin the journey to undo the institutionalized, oppressed, racist systems and caste and all of these things. But until we're willing to come to a place of healing for ourselves, I think we will continue to struggle, and we will continue to perpetuate, and we will continue to always try to move from that. But we haven't done our internalized work that needs to happen as we move forward. I think it's important to talk about it.
Thank you, Akuye. Perfect. Really appreciate that. I'm going to go now to Adrian to also offer, and then we'll turn it over to the panelists for their final words on these two questions. Go ahead, Adrian.
Okay, so I was sitting here and I was thinking, and it got me to thinking, what advice would you guys give somebody that maybe not, that doesn't know their migration history, or that the, you know, or that the grandparents or the great grandparents are gone, so you don't really know what the history is, or the stories that are got left behind, so you don't really, you know what is your pattern or what is your migration. Yeah, you grew up, got family in the South, but you know, you don't know nothing about them. Or how would you go about giving advice about someone, or even just trying to find your own migration now, being your own self, even though you might not know, because I don't know a whole lot about my family history, but I know I have family and they've done moved everywhere, and so it's like, well, I can't really get the information that I need to know my background, so how am I supposed to get it? Do I make my own memories of my own migration and my own history, or, you know, what do you do with the broken stories that you can't get back? Thank you.
Thank you. And panelists, if you could give a brief response, we want to save time for give back, and we want to really give back to this rich, rich tapestry. So we'll hear from each of you as quickly as you can.
Hi, I guess what kind of came up to me when I was listening to Karen was, you know, you talk about that assimilation that occurs. And, you know, to me, and part of my journey in exploring, you know, through my dissertation, the Indigenous educational trauma, right? And having my grandfather be a boarding school survivor, et cetera. And all of us are survivors of educational trauma. And we try to unearth that, you know, in our program and through our pedagogy. And but I guess the part of this, the solution or part of the healing work, repair work, is done through the creation of programs like Native Pathways and through Evergreen-Tacoma. I mean, this, you know, our learning institutions is one of the sources of our pain and our trauma, but I think that what we are doing is making it a place where that healing can now begin. And so, and it's kind of to address you as well, Adrian, it's, you know, we have tons of students, again, because it's an Indigenous program, that whether they're stolen ones, you know, our lost birds, you know, we sometimes refer to in Native communities, the children that were adopted out and have no idea who their ancestors are. It is not an uncommon narrative, right, in our communities. And so, but through these programs, through, you know, moments like this together, where I can feel, and I know, Dr. Shepherd, I've heard you say this before as well, and I think of you every time that our ancestors are in this room together, in this space together right now, right? It's a virtual space, but we're all here together, and we bring them with us, even if we can't visualize them or name them, they're here. And I think beginning with that acknowledgement, and just taking the moment when we're in space and community together to again, kind of make the introductions, right? We bring our ancestors, we introduce them, even if we can't see them or name them, they're here with us, and just hanging on to that. And, you know, again, the idea is that we're here creating spaces where our children don't have to assimilate. You know, that's the whole point of these programs, is to create these spaces where we don't have to assimilate anymore. And we can begin to address those broken stories and even change the narrative, you know, instead of calling them broken, you know, they're undiscovered maybe. But, you know, thinking of a way to start bringing healing or reparative language into that narrative of your story, and start with the thinnest threads you can find, you know, and just start weaving, because as we've been saying this morning, you know, our stories, our experiences are interlinked and interwoven. And so your story is connected to my story, even in just this moment here. And so we just begin to weave with whatever threads and fibers we can grasp. And I think that's the beginning.
Thank you. Another panelist want to jump in?
Sure. I want to read you this little affirmation I wrote a couple of years ago, just to my community. So just bear with me. It's not super long, but it reads, I just want to say how proud I am to be African American, how proud I am to be Black. I know many folks have issues with the term African American, but understand that it's the African inside you that they've been unsuccessfully attempting to kill this entire time. Nevertheless, Black youth continue to manifest and reconstruct our indigeneities everywhere. Crump is as African and Black as a Kombi, Capoeira, and Kwaito. With love, a cut tree will sprout its roots. With love, a cut branch will sprout its roots. This is the nature of trees. I cherish the power of history and knowledge, but I recognize that information does not and will never qualify my identity as an African or as a Black person. I don't care how disconnected or uneducated people accuse you of being. Love is all you need to know who you are. The more I see you through the spirit, the more I realize that history is just here to congratulate the living love in you, to remind us you were never alone, to give us some advice and let you know there is no limit on how boldly we can be ourselves. I love you.
Kiara, you can go ahead.
Oh no, I'll let us end on that. That wrapped it up for me.
Dr. Morales.
Thank you, Anthony. First, thank you, Chris. I really appreciate that affirmation. Inspires me to kind of think about my own, just my own story in that way. First of all, I don't have, I really just want to leave it with that. I think that's a powerful way to end this. So this notion of, you know, beginning with our stories, not thinking about broken, you know, and I think thinking about as whole, right? We're whole beings and we have whole stories. And I think that the systems and structures want to sort of continue to emphasize these deficit-based approaches to our stories, right? In the ways that we're seen as incomplete, right? Or in the classroom spaces, the ways that we're asked to check part of ourselves at the doors. And I think that we need to disrupt that by first thinking of ourselves as already whole, right? And already having stories and whole stories that we begin in different points. You know, we're all beginning in different points, but they're whole. And Chris, your affirmation really speaks to that, right? And sort of speaks to that and is driven by that self-love that I really, really love, that we're kind of wrapping up in that note. I have to disconnect now, y'all. I have gateways. I start with Green Hill now, so I don't want to keep them waiting, but it was such an honor to be here. I really, really appreciate this time with y'all. And I hope that we can see each other virtually and hopefully sometime soon in the soon future in person. So thanks you all so much for the invitation.
Thank you, and our love to Gateway, our
Bye.
love to you, and thank you for being with us. We'll be sure that the give back you get tonight is extra special. So thank you, folks. Let's now do a very quick give back. We're very behind time, but this was a rich panel, excellent questions, excellent panelists, lots to think about, lots to feel, lots to process. But please, if we could do 5 quick give backs from folks that we haven't heard from yet today, I really appreciate it. Who'd like to start?
I'd really like to say thank you. And I did not get to ask my question, but Dr. Zargos has promised me I can ask it next time. But I wanted to say that as a Jewish person whose family immigrated here and migrated across the country to Seattle, I really resonated with all of y'all's stories in a way that I think a lot of times Jewish people don't really get to. And there are so many pieces of this history that Jewish people are so uniquely un-American in origin, whereas everyone else has been very much a part of the American story of oppression. Jewish people are a bit more of a recent addition, and it was nice and meaningful to me to get to relate to all of these stories of these people who are so deeply entrenched in this American history.
Thank you, Allison. Much appreciated. I'm going to go to Kenya next.
Well, I just wanted to say thank you all for coming to our Sankofa community and just being here to share your experiences. I think, like for me, I know I wrote something in the little box, but I just feel like there are a lot of connections within what you all have shared today with the things that we're learning in class. And I just want to say that it is important. And the things that people don't touch on now are the healing of the mental distress that you have to go through and that you face from being snatched from your homes, or, you know, not knowing who you are, not knowing your identity, not understanding it. So I just want to say thank you all for sharing your stories and your experiences. And it just has really encouraged me to continue to dig deep into who I am, what I stand for, and not allowing other people to project what they think I am or who I am. That was a little bit weird, but all of that.
Thank you, Kenya. One more give back.
I'll go a little bit. Hi. Thank you guys so much. My mind has been kind of blown a little bit this morning, and I guess like the kind of thing that's like sticking out in my head, I'm sorry, is like I kind of like as a young person knowing that my grandma is full Hispanic. She's from like Colorado, but her parents are from Mexico, and I just have always felt in my immediate family a negative light on that history, because just from like a few men in my family having been military and stuff like that. But just like hearing the stories of all of you addressing this and making a real effort to really change what it means to you and your family, and then it like growing from there. Like I feel like I was like, oh, my grandma's just like that, like it's just gonna be that way. But like just in the last couple weeks, I have been so inspired and like convinced that it's very, very changeable and moldable, and that her mind is still growing, and that she still is, learning to address and confront these feelings. And so it's really inspiring, and it shows me that it's that we're all still able to change into a better version of ourselves, where we accept ourselves and know that we are whole, so that's just really inspiring, you guys. Thank you so much. I really, really appreciate it. Happy that you all were here.
Thank you. And we're going to go to Dr. Bacho for the faculty give back, and then to Natasha for the final give back, please. Dr. Bacho.
Thank you very much. This was a wonderful panel. It triggered emotional, heartfelt discussion. It forced our students to look within themselves and to search for answers. It's very stimulating, and it ties in brilliantly, in my opinion, with the two books on movement, which are wonderful books: The Parable of the Sower and The Warmth of Other Suns. And we're going to have a very lively seminar because of your contribution, your participation this morning. You have enriched our learning community. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Bacho. Natasha.
Thank you, Dr. Bacho. I want to say that this panel was amazing. I loved hearing the diversity in your stories. And I think that they just kind of reinvigorated that desire to dig deep and to attempt as much as possible to retrace our roots, but then to also continue to build the bonds and create the stories that exist within our own families. So thank you so much for that. I grew up in an older generation of families. My mother was born in 1942, her parents 1900, 1910. My father was a military man, lived in California and Oregon most of my life. And so for me, the stories I've asked, my grandparents are all gone. And a lot of the stories I hear from my own parents is that upon inquiries about their history, the answers were often, what do you want to know that for? And so I appreciate you guys sharing and recognizing that, you know, sometimes our history is deeply buried and we have to go to great lengths to discover that. So thank you for that. This talk of migration was a great conversation today, as many of us migrate through our studies, and for me, migrating through my career.